All right, Prime Minister Modi has landed in Singapore to a roaring welcome. It is a two-day visit. This is the second leg of his two-nation tour, and this will be the fifth time that Prime Minister Modi will visit Singapore. India and Singapore have elevated their ties since 2005 with trade and connectivity and deeper linkages in the areas of fintech as well as IT likely to be the key thrust areas in this visit. There's also an expectation that more pacts could be signed between India and Singapore related primarily to closer movement of people as well as swifter movement of funds, which is related to banking and the IT and fintech space. Singapore accounts for a large market from where Indian companies have been raising funds. It's also a key source of FDI for the Indian economy. Equally important, Singapore is the gateway for India to connect more with the entire ASEAN region. Remember, India has chosen to stay out of RCEP, and which is why it needs to build on creating more avenues to ensure it has deeper engagement and connectivity with the entire ASEAN region. First up, take a look at this report that highlights the significance of this visit, why it matters, and then we come back and talk more on that.
After 6 years, Prime Minister Narendra Modi is visiting Singapore at the invitation of his Singaporean counterpart, Lawrence Wong.
Prime Minister is visiting Singapore after nearly 6 years. In fact, his last visit to Singapore was in his first term as Prime Minister, and an early visit during his third term is something that is particularly welcomed by the Singaporean side. And also, this is at the time when a new leader in Singapore, in His Excellency Prime Minister Lawrence Wong, has just taken over. And this is an opportune time to set the stage for the next stage of our vibrant bilateral relationship.
The visit comes a week after the second round of India-Singapore Ministerial Roundtable held in Singapore. The Indian delegation included Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, Foreign Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar, Commerce Minister Mr. Piyush Goyal, and Information and Broadcasting Minister Ashwini Vaishnav. The meet reviewed progress of key bilateral issues and identified advanced manufacturing and connectivity as thrust areas. As India's sixth largest trade partner and largest source of FDI, PM's visit is expected to push the pedal on bilateral trade.
Singapore is India's sixth largest trade partner worldwide and the largest source of FDI during the last financial year. Investments have also been very large. Since 2000 till now, we have had cumulative FDI of about 160 billion US dollars.
One area of interest or congruence between the two countries is semiconductors, and Singapore has a wide range of expertise in manufacture, fabricating, or even producing semiconductors in its region. And India will be expecting a deeper and serious cooperation with Singapore in this domain.
India has deep strategic and commercial interests in Singapore. There are over 9,000 Indian companies registered in Singapore. 80% of listed offshore bonds by Indian issuers are listed on Singapore Stock Exchange. In February 2023, India's UPI and Singapore's PayNow connected for speedier remittances between the two nations. The visit comes as India is countering Chinese influence in its maritime domain by pushing ahead its Act East policy. As New Delhi continues to build on its role as a major player in the Indo-Pacific, these visits will pave the way for deeper strategic and trade collaboration between India and the entire ASEAN region. Mohammad Ghazali for NDTV.
All right, there are multiple legs to this visit. It is significant for a variety of reasons, trade being one of them, connectivity another aspect of it, maritime security, the larger implications of what India wants to do in terms of its Act East policy. We'll try and cover all that with an esteemed panel, Girija Pande, Chairman, Chain IQ, and joining me from Singapore, Amitendu Palit, who is at the National University of Singapore, also joining me from Singapore, as well as Professor Pant, who is the Director of Studies and Head of the Strategic Studies Program at ORF. Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you so much for taking out the time and speaking to me. Let me start with you, Professor Pant, which is that when we talk about this visit, as I said, there are multiple legs to it, whether it's the trade, the connectivity, the larger strategic aspects, and the economic implications of this. We'll try and cover one by one all aspects of it. But first up, how do you see the India-Singapore relationship building from here on? It's already seen major upgrades in the last 19 years. How do you see it now going forward?
Thanks, Gaurie. I think, Singapore has always had a very special place in India's Southeast Asia engagement. In fact, it has been a bridge to India's Southeast Asia outreach. And in that sense, I think the next phase perhaps lies as India builds its ties with other members of Southeast Asia individually. Because there is a certain desegregation we are now witnessing in India's bilateral outreach to individual member states. I think Singapore will continue to play a very important role. And as you mentioned, this is a relationship that traverses various spheres. So this is not a unidimensional relationship. And given the nature and the multidimensional nature of this relationship, I think that perhaps now the scaling up of this relationship is going to, is likely to happen. And in more ways than one, perhaps we are looking at trade, connectivity, defense, security, but also, given that the fact of digitization that has become very important. We have just had the ministerial meetings between India and Singapore, where a very expansive agenda across the critical ministries was laid out. So I think this is the time now to look to see more ambition in this relationship. And perhaps, given that this is Prime Minister Modi's 5th visit to Singapore,
yes,
it in itself underscores the commitment that India has in this relationship as it builds a wider Southeast Asian engagement.
Absolutely, absolutely. Mr. Pandey, let me ask you this, that how pivotal is Singapore, first from larger point of view, from the connectivity point of view between India and ASEAN and the trade opportunities it could throw up?
As you mentioned, we've already had 19 years of a very fruitful commercial exchange with Singapore, especially after the signing of the SICA, which was the free trade agreement between India's first free trade agreement with Singapore. And that has really shown promise. Now, after that, there have been Indian companies who've been based in Singapore, who are growing in the region using ASEAN. It's a springboard for ASEAN and the wider Asia Pacific. So we can see a fair amount of trade and investment on both sides. India has invested in Singapore, Singapore has invested in India. The trade has been growing, and therefore we can see that as India now, especially you asked me about in future, especially in the semiconductor chain, as India now progresses into the semiconductor chain, setting up fabs and testing and packaging facilities, Singapore is very important node in the global semiconductor chain.
Right.
There are companies here who can provide skills, they can provide components, who can provide training, and who can provide investment as India grows into the semiconductor stage. So that is the first issue. The second issue is how to go to the wider ASEAN region from Singapore. Singapore is very well connected in ASEAN. In fact, it's one of the original members of the ASEAN. And therefore, there's a wider market of 650 million people.
Exactly.
Where Indian companies must grow. Thirdly, ASEAN and Singapore in particular are export-oriented economies, export manufacturing. India can learn a lot from export manufacturing and export orientation of this part of the world.
Absolutely. Okay. Amitendu Palit, specifically if one were to talk about the semiconductor industry that Singapore has, it contributes to around 10% of the global semiconductor output, 5% of the global wafer fabrication capacity, 20% in terms of the equipment production. So the question is that how does India go about making best utilization of Singapore's ecosystem management experience? That's what is really done here. How do Indians marry their design capabilities with the Singaporean experience as far as the semiconductor industry is concerned?
I think I'll put it in this context that Prime Minister Modi's visit is a very important signal that India wants to work closely with Singapore in the Indo-Pacific region. And when I say that, I'm mindful of the fact that India and Singapore, along with 6 more Southeast Asian countries and a large number of other countries, are a member of the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum. And within this IPF, there is a very strong emphasis on development of the semiconductor industry. I think what India is looking to do insofar as its engagement with Singapore on the specific subject of semiconductor capacity building is concerned, that India has already signaled its intention to become a global semiconductor hub in the foreseeable medium term. There are significant investments that are happening in India from domestic investors as well as foreign investors in building important capacities. But perhaps the fact to be noted over here is that semiconductor industry is a production process where no country on its own in the world can actually claim to be having the entire supply chain located within itself. It has to rely on other parts of the world for sourcing specific comparative advantages. And to that extent, India is clearly keen on working as effectively and closely as it can with its Indo-Pacific partners. These are countries like Korea, Japan, the United States, Malaysia, Vietnam, and obviously in that entire group of countries, Singapore is an extremely important partner. So what we can look to see is that India's advantages at the one end of the upstream and one end of the downstream needs to be balanced by the advantages that you mentioned, the wafer, the fab, and so on and so forth. And we can expect, in addition to this, a lot of conversation in the area of skill and management expertise insofar as bringing semiconductor production to a successful integration of supply chains is concerned.
Absolutely. I think some of that expansion for Singapore companies could also take place in India. That's another opportunity that lies. And 9 out of the 15 top semiconductor companies have presence in Singapore, and the scaling up of those operations could actually take place in India. But Professor Pant, if one were to now, take a slightly big picture view in terms of India-Singapore ties, trade is one aspect, as I said, the larger strategic implications of this, the Act East policy that India is now pushing the pedal on, that rests to a large extent also on the relationship that India and Singapore have in terms of its larger impact for maritime security.
Yes, absolutely. I think Singapore's critical position at the very center of the East-West shipping lane, very important maritime domain in terms of the wider Indo-Pacific. ASEAN centrality is critical for India's Indo-Pacific outreach, and I think in that ASEAN centrality, Singapore is very critical anchor. So in more ways than one, Singapore becomes such an important partner for India because historically the comfort level between India and Sri Lanka had been remarkable, both from the non-alignment days to the contemporary times where this idea of engagement between India and Singapore has allowed for new possibilities to emerge in India's engagement with wider Southeast Asia. So even when the wider Southeast Asian engagement has been relatively lackluster, I think bilateral engagement with Singapore has been quite solid, and in that has allowed for new possibilities to emerge in India's, the kind of role that India had wanted to play. And maritime security is right at the heart of this debate today, because Indo-Pacific debate, strategic debate today centers around what is going to happen in the maritime domain and how security and stability in the maritime domain, whether it is trade or whether it is connectivity, is contingent on what I think the countries, the stakeholders in the region can bring to bear in the maritime domain. Yes. And I think therefore India's partnership with Singapore yes, and with other like-minded countries in the region becomes so very critical. Yes. Because that is the wider maritime landscape is going to be shaped up.
Absolutely. Girija Pande, I want to bring you in on the fact that in the last couple of months itself, India has reached out to several partners, whether it's hosting Vietnam, Malaysia, reaching out to Brunei, Singapore, and so on. Does this reflect the urgency in terms of addressing a region where some skeptics would believe that China does have deeper engagements in, historically has greater presence in, and now India is sort of pushing the pedal on it?
Well, certainly the Chinese have also been here, and historically both countries have been here. If you look back nearly thousands of years, India and China were both in ASEAN. And in fact, many parts of India, ASEAN are called Indo-China. So there has been a historic link by both countries. The issue is that the Chinese trade relationship with ASEAN is much, much bigger than with India, because in fact, for most of them, China is the largest trading partner by far, even ahead of the Americans. So India certainly has a catch up to do. The Indian companies are here. The free trade agreement has been signed. India has not signed the RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Program, which China has signed and others, which gives them some advantage. But India has to make up, and we need to have our Indian companies moving out to such a large area of nearly 650 million people. Now we need to find ways of doing business. All these countries are different. Thailand is different to Malaysia. Malaysia is different to Indonesia. Philippines is different. These are big, largish economies. In fact,
Exactly.
as you know, Indonesia is something like 250 million people.
Right.
So we have to catch up as the growth in these countries is going on. It's been an average growth of 5%.
Yes, and I think that's the reason why this region is so important, because that's the trade and security conundrum that ASEAN faces, which is that the security threat is also most from China and the trade exposure is also maximum to China, which is why relationship and strategic relationship with India could actually be hugely beneficial both for New Delhi and of course for ASEAN regions as well. Amitendu Palit, as we wrap up this discussion, I want to ask you what according to you should be the 2 or 3 key pivotal areas that you would expect more focus to be on. Of course, trade is likely to be a pivotal area. Defense, already there's been a lot of cooperation that has happened in the last, and they are already building on it. But what do you think would stand out for you?
You know, the trend, the conversation still now, and let's not forget the fact that only the previous week, the India-Singapore Ministerial Roundtable was held, where the prominent ministers from both countries bilaterally discussed a number of issues. I think there are 2 areas, in addition to the ones that we have already discussed, which are essentially going to be part of a defining package of sectors across which India and Singapore would be collaborating. The first of this, I can broadly say, sustainability, clean economy, and the green economy, where a lot of engagement has been happening between the 2 countries. And that is a sector where both countries would learn to work from each other and work with each other insofar as taking forward their mutual agendas are concerned. And the second, something on which some progress has already been achieved insofar as digital connectivity is concerned, through interoperable digital platforms between India's UPI and Singapore's PayNow. And one can expect some more progress, some more expansion, some more widening of this digital connectivity during the time that Mr. Modi is here.
Absolutely. I expect that as well, sir. Whether it is about the GIFT City, whether it is about ONDC, I expect a lot more cooperation on these specific areas. As I said, I wrap up with what I started with, which is movement of people, movement of funds. Both of them are likely to find a lot of focus in Prime Minister Modi's 5th visit to Singapore. Appreciate, gentlemen, for taking out the time and speaking to me on India Global. And